So in my last video, I wrote the introduction to my newspaper report, which summarised the whole story, and then I also wrote another paragraph explaining that Zoe was left on Norwich when her parents got in the boat without her. Now I've written 3 more paragraphs which explain what happened, so let's read through what I've written. Zoe was left to look after herself. She was able to find a boat. She rowed away from Norwich. She wanted to reach the mainland. She got to Eels Island. It was horrible. But she did meet William. He encouraged her to continue. War broke out between the Eels and another tribe. Zoe escaped with Munchkin. Her boat capsized, but Zoe and her friend were rescued by a fishing boat. It took them to a hospital in Hope. So I'm pleased with my punctuation here. I'm also pleased that I have managed to keep tense consistent throughout, so it's all in past tense. And I also think I've organised my paragraphs well. So we've got a first paragraph which explains Zoe leaving Norwich. Then we've got a second paragraph which explains what happened on Eels Island. And then in the third paragraph, Zoe and Munchkin are rescued and taken to the mainland. But I think I need to add a bit more detail, and I also think I need to consider my sentence openers. So if I look at my first paragraph, the words I've used to open my sentences are Zoe, she, and she. So let's look at this first sentence. Zoe was left to look after herself. I'm going to change the words look after. I'm going to write Zoe was left to fend for herself. Because if you fend for yourself, that suggests danger. And Zoe was in a dangerous situation. I also think I could combine my first 2 sentences. So rather than Zoe was left to fend for herself, she was able to find a boat, I can start with left to fend for herself, and then I can place a comma before the main clause, she was able to find a boat. So rather than she, I can have Zoe. Left to fend for herself, Zoe was able to find a boat. She rowed away from Norwich. Now, I can include a relative clause here because Zoe used the boat to row away from Norwich. So I'm going to write Zoe was able to find a boat which she used. Or which she used to row away from Norwich. And perhaps I can have an adverb here as well. How did Zoe row? Well, I want to emphasise Zoe's bravery in my report. So I'm going to write which she used to bravely row away from Norwich. She wanted to reach the mainland. Now that's some extra information. So rather than starting a sentence with she wanted, I can extend this sentence with a comma, and then I can write wanting, so I can use the ing form of the verb to reach the mainland. Or perhaps I'll write, rather than wanting, let's write hoping to reach the mainland. So now let's read back this first paragraph. Left to fend for herself, Zoe was able to find a boat. Let's have find and repair a boat to emphasise that it wasn't easy for Zoe to escape. Left to fend for herself, Zoe was able to find and repair a boat, which she used to bravely row away from Norwich, hoping to reach the mainland. Now the next sentence, she got to Il's Island. That's not a very interesting sentence. So let's have a think about how I can start that sentence. I could use an adverbial opener, like on her way, she got to Il's Island. Though got isn't a very interesting word, perhaps I need to change that. Rather than she got to, how about she arrived at Il's Island? Apart from it was horrible, I've not said much about Il's Island, so let's add some description. Let me think about the buildings on Il's Island. How could I describe them? They were crumbling, dilapidated, miserable. Let's have, on her way, she arrived at Il's Island with its miserable, dilapidated buildings. And I want to describe the cathedral as well. What could I say about the cathedral? And let's call it a crumbling cathedral. So let's read that sentence back now. On her way, she arrived at Il's Island with its miserable, dilapidated buildings and crumbling cathedral. It was horrible. How could I change the sentence, it was horrible? Well, let's mention that Zoe saw horrible things, or perhaps Zoe witnessed some horrific scenes and soon realised, what can I say, soon realised that most of the people on the island were horrible. Or rather than most of the people, let's have most of the inhabitants of the island were, and rather than horrible, how could I describe most of the people on Il's Island? Let's use the words savage and barbaric. So let's read back through that sentence. Zoe witnessed some horrific scenes and soon realised, let's have soon realised that, most of the inhabitants of the island were savage and barbaric. I feel that we should maybe mention do be as well. Or perhaps let's just have most of the inhabitants of the island, including its leader, were savage and barbaric. But she did meet William. So rather than but, let's have however. However, she did meet William. Let's use an adverbial of place as well. However, on the island, she did meet William. He encouraged her to continue. Rather than he, because the he is about William, rather than starting a new sentence with a pronoun, I can use the relative pronoun who to continue the sentence after a comma. However, on the island, she did meet William, let's scroll down a bit, who encouraged her to continue. Let's explain how he encouraged her to continue. He told her stories. So let's have William who told her stories, which encouraged her to continue. Rather than to continue, let's think of a stronger word. What word could I have that means to keep going even when you're finding things difficult? Let's have encouraged her to persevere. And rather than encouraged, can we think of an even stronger word for encouraged? Stronger than encouraged. Let's have which inspired her to persevere. War broke out between the Eels and another tribe. Zoe escaped with Munchkin. I think we can combine those two sentences. Let's have when war broke out between the Eels and another tribe, comma, Zoe escaped with Munchkin. And let's explain who Munchkin is. He was the only other friend, apart from William, she had made there. And perhaps apart from William could be in brackets, because that's extra information, that's parenthesis. So let's read through this second paragraph now. On her way, she arrived at Eels Island, with its miserable, dilapidated buildings and crumbling cathedral. Zoe witnessed some horrific scenes, and soon realised that most of the inhabitants of the island, including its leader, were savage and barbaric. However, on the island, she did meet William, who told her stories which inspired her to persevere. When war broke out between the Eels and another tribe, Zoe escaped with Munchkin, the only other friend, apart from William, she had made there. So now let's move on to this third paragraph. Her boat capsized, but Zoe and her friend were rescued by a fishing boat. It took them to a hospital in Hope. Well, let's have an adverbial of place to open our sentence. Rather than her boat capsized, let's say where her boat capsized. Let's have in the middle of the ocean, comma, her boat capsized. Perhaps we can add a bit more detail. Rather than her boat, let's have Zoe's rowing boat capsized. But Zoe and her friend were rescued by a fishing boat. Perhaps we could extend that sentence, and rather than but starting a new sentence, we can use it to connect to what's written previously. Zoe's rowing boat capsized, but Zoe and her friend were rescued. Let's add an adverb. Let's have but luckily Zoe and her friend were rescued by a fishing boat. It took them to a hospital in Hope. Because the it refers to the fishing boat that's just been mentioned, rather than starting a new sentence with a pronoun, let's use the relative pronoun which, because we're describing or we're giving more information about the fishing boat, which took them to a hospital in Hope. Well, let's have which took them both to a hospital in Hope. So let's read through this third paragraph. In the middle of the ocean, Zoe's rowing boat capsized, but luckily Zoe and her friend were rescued by a fishing boat, which took them both to a hospital in Hope.